Iran sets out its conditions for an end to the war, rejecting the U.S. list of 15 demands. Tehran says they don't reflect reality, while Donald Trump threatens to unleash hell if his terms aren't met. So what are the red lines for both sides? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Fuli Batibo. Iran is at war with the US and Israel. They're not talking directly, but this week both sides outlined their demands. Tehran says Washington's position is not based on reality and it's continuing to attack Israel and Gulf states. President Donald Trump is threatening to unleash hell, as he put it, if Iran doesn't submit to his conditions. We'll go into the detail of both sides' demands during the program. The Islamic Republic views the war as an existential battle against the U.S. and Israel, its greatest enemies. For the U.S., it's a fight with Israel to overcome their most powerful adversary in the Middle East. So for both parties, what are the red lines in this conflict? And does Israel have different red lines to the U.S.? We'll talk to our guest shortly. First, this report from Laura Khan.
Just days after US President Donald Trump announced a break in the war, he sent a 15-point peace plan to Iran via intermediaries. The rhetoric seems to be more threatening.
President Trump does not bluff, and he is prepared to unleash hell.
Tehran denies it's been involved in any discussions on ending the war.
There is no negotiation taking place, but the very fact that they are mobilizing their highest-ranking officials to negotiate with the Islamic Republic indicates that they have accepted defeat.
Seemingly in response to the proposal, Iranian state media published the country's red lines. They include a complete halt to all aggression and assassinations, guarantees against future attacks, and reparations for damages. Tehran is also demanding an end to the war on all fronts and for all resistance groups, as well as recognition of Iran's sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz. Iran has made clear that these are not bargaining chips, but necessary for its future security, especially the Strait of Hormuz, its strongest leverage, as 20% of the world's energy passes through that waterway. While the White House has not released its full proposal, US media have reported some of the points. They include demands for Iran to dismantle its nuclear facilities, pledge to never develop a nuclear weapon, and limit the range and number of ballistic missiles it has. The US also wants the Strait of Hormuz fully reopened and for Iran to end its support for regional allies. The US also seems to be giving itself the option of maximum maneuverability and has ordered thousands of additional troops to the region. Meanwhile, Israel and the US have maintained their attacks across Iran. Multiple explosions hit the northeastern city of Mashhad, and a strike near Shiraz killed 2 children. Iran has continued firing missiles at Israel. Tel Aviv and Kfar Qassam were targeted on Thursday, with falling debris causing injuries. Despite talk of indirect diplomacy, more US troops are headed to the region, and Iran says it's ready for an invasion. Laura Khan for Inside Story, Al Jazeera.
Let's bring in our guest now. Joining us from Tehran is Abbas Aslani, a senior research fellow at the Center for Middle East Strategic Studies. Ellie Germania is in London. She's a senior policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations and specializes in Europe-Iran relations. And in Washington, D.C. is Thomas Warwick, a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council. Welcome to you all. Thank you so much for joining us on Inside Story. Abbas Aslani in Tehran, let me start with you. So Iran has laid out 5 conditions for ending the war, including payment of reparations and sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz. What does Iran view as non-negotiable in these terms? And is there any flexibility behind the public rhetoric?
Well, on week 4 of the hostility folly, we are seeing that Iran is not exhibiting any sign of surrender or weakness, but it is trying to somehow shift from its operational posture, meaning from fighting for the survival into, changing the immediate threat into long-term strategic opportunities. So that's why Iran sees that the region and the situation condition, even between Iran and the United States, has changed. So the terms that were on the table previously cannot be, subject to negotiations. At a time that it is like in let's say, in the war, like in a boxing ring and being cornered, talking of negotiations between before the hostilities stop is not acceptable for Tehran. So that's why Iran is demanding rapid cessation of the war, as well as to make sure that the shadow of the war is removed from above the country.
Right.
More important than an immediate ceasefire is to make sure that this will not happen again in future. And also, Iran is trying to have the international community to recognize its sovereignty over Strait of Hormuz. Mm-hmm. This is part of that perspective here in Tehran, that the situation has changed. And the terms have been, tabled by the United States are maximalist.
Right.
So by the time that the situation does not change, it will not be acceptable for Tehran to engage in.
But is there any flexibility, Abbas
negotiations.
Aslani, on any of those terms that Iran has laid out? Is there any flexibility? Is there any point on which they're willing to negotiate?
Tehran is afraid that any flexibility could be interpreted as a sign of weakness. They are trying to argue that if the United States decided about the timing of the initiation of this aggression, they will not be the ones to end it. So one thing which is important for Tehran is the timing and the quality of ending this conflict.
Okay.
And if Tehran thinks that they have been able to reach to a point that there will be a kind of objective guarantee that the U.S. and Israel will not attack the country again in future, I think we can expect a kind of, let's say, engagement in that point, maybe seeing a relative, flexibility.
Okay.
But at the moment, and as we speak, it doesn't seem that we are in that point.
Okay. Thomas Warwick, Iran's demands have been described as being unrealistic by Washington. But are there any parts of Tehran's list that the U.S. could quietly accept as a starting point for talks?
Well, greetings to you and to your other guests and to your viewers. What happens in private in these negotiations is different from what is going on in public. There's another front in this war, and it's the battle for international public opinion. So both sides are talking tough in public. What they say in private may be different. And the interesting thing is that what's not on that list is what happens to Iran's nuclear program. Foreign Minister Araghchi has said repeatedly that Iran has never said it has current intentions to develop nuclear weapons. And yet, as American officials point out, Iran has enriched uranium far in excess of whatever is required for peaceful purposes. So there's a big difference between what goes on and what is discussed in public. So I have no doubt that there are proposals being exchanged. The gap, as Abbas has said, is enormous between the positions of the two parties. Mm-hmm. And if the gap does not close, then the war will continue.
Ellie, your thoughts about this? Are these red lines truly about national security or regime survival and political image for either side?
Look, I think at some point, there's inevitably going to be some serious, genuine negotiations between the two sides, but it doesn't seem we're quite there yet. And the risk threshold for both sides is still quite vast. I think part of the problem on the US side is that it is trying to throw the kitchen sink at these negotiations at a time where it's putting the gun to Iran's head. And Iran has basically rejected capitulating to US demands in a wartime situation, and it's not going to be possible to squeeze those assets out from Iran in a way that they couldn't even do so in Geneva at the negotiating table, because Iran feels like so far it has managed to muddle through and reestablish some degree of deterrence vis-a-vis the US through the strangulation of the Strait of Hormuz. Now, I think the way out of this is for both sides to first reach a halt in the bombing, the strikes, as the initial steps of the ceasefire, to create the space for those serious, genuine negotiation on nuclear and non-nuclear issues. But trying to connect that directly to a ceasefire, I think, is going to be very difficult because the two sides need very lengthy technical negotiations with a good, substantial technical team from the US side, unlike what they brought to the table in Geneva before this war started, so that they can actually get a deal done.
Let me ask you about that, Thomas Warwick, the negotiating team. I mean, even with President Trump's stand swinging between threats and talk of a potential deal, how do U.S. negotiators maintain a coherent policy? And are America's red lines genuine or situational, depending on domestic politics?
So Iran needs to appreciate that the Trump administration does not negotiate the way the Obama administration negotiated the 2016 nuclear deal. There will be no technical specialists in these negotiations. They will be back in Washington. They will take back proposals that are handed to people who Donald Trump trusts.
But isn't that an issue, that there are no technical negotiators in these talks?
This is the way Trump negotiates, and Iran needs to understand this. This is not going to change. The negotiations are going to be with people Donald Trump trusts to make deals on his behalf. He expects to negotiate with an empowered Iranian counterpart who can make a deal. This is part of the problem. The cultural misunderstandings are enormous. That's what led us into this war in the first place. The failure to turn over the written proposal of Iran at the February 26 talks was enormously damaging. And that set the tone for the skeptical look at what Iran did present. And all the United States saw was the Iranians intend to cheat, and they're not even being subtle about it. And so this has to be understood. The way the United States expects to be dealt with is an agreement on the high-level principle of serious relinquishment of Iran's nuclear capabilities, and then we will talk about the technical details.
Okay.
This is the reality. Iran can't think that this is going to negotiate the same way the 2016 nuclear deal did.
Abbas
it will not happen that way.
Your thoughts about what Thomas Warwick said there. Issue is clearly a trust here, given that Iran's past experience with the collapse talks, every time there was some sort of a deal, there was an attack afterwards. So what kind of guarantees would Tehran be looking for if these talks were to go ahead?
Fully, Iran this time is not seeking to reach a kind of, let's say, agreement or a guarantee being, offered by the United States, but it thinks that an objective, let's say, guarantee could be a situation whereby enough costs have been inflicted on the United States and Israel that will make them to think twice before initiating another round of military action against the country. And despite the talks and the media spin by U.S. President Donald Trump, there have been no negotiations, and it has been mostly the escalation efforts by intermediaries in order to communicate baseline demands, which to Tehran this seems maximalist. But Tehran is looking at the hardware in addition to the rhetoric which it is hearing from the U.S. side. U.S. is trying to deploy more forces to the region. There are plans to proceed like occupying a number of islands in southern Iran, which Iran is thinking that this might be a kind of let's say, deception as it happened in the past, to buy time and to proceed with those plans in order to bring a new round of escalation against the country. And that's why this makes, that trust issue, again, very significant and important. And Iran is hesitant about what the real intentions back in Washington are.
Ellie, there's clearly a lack of trust here, but I want to talk a bit more about the red lines that we're talking about here, that we're focusing on in this discussion program. President Trump again demanded a full end to Iran's uranium enrichment, which Tehran has rejected for nearly 2 decades now. Why is enrichment such an immovable red line for Iran, even though it continues to complicate the negotiation?
I think there's two separate things. One is that Iran will not negotiate over its right, as it perceives it, to enrich at a future date. Practically right now, after the June bombings against Iranian nuclear facilities, Iran is understood not to be enriching. And from what we have gathered from the Geneva talks before this latest round of attacks began, Iran was proposing some sort of a pause in its enrichment voluntarily for the rest of the Trump administration, giving President Trump quite a big win to say that Iran is practically at zero enrichment, at least under his presidency. What the US has not been able to do through forcing Iran with 2 decades of sanctions and now war combined with political isolation is for Iran to accept, to give up this right to enrichment. And I think we need to find flexibility on the US side on this issue, the same way that Iran will have to understand that there is no way that under this US administration all American sanctions will be lifted. If any, frankly, it may well be that we're in a space where certain economic breathing room will have to be provided. For example, let me give you a test case here. In wartime, the US Treasury has been ordered by the US president to provide Iran with unprecedented oil waivers to sell its oil as part of a drive to drive prices down because of the current war. What the US should be prepared to do is to extend those waivers as part of a peacetime arrangement with Iran as well. So there are creative solutions, but both sides have to climb down on some of these maximalist expectations.
All right, Thomas Warwick, can we expect a climb down from the US on the enrichment issue, especially as Ellie says there, when the Geneva talks happened, a day before the war began, Oman reported that the Iranians had agreed to suspend or even lower enrichment levels temporarily, at least. Why is this still an issue for the Trump administration? Why is this something that they're not willing to budge on?
Because the Iranian offer was to go down to 20% enrichment through a research reactor loophole. And the Americans were well aware that that would still allow them to have enormous amounts of uranium within striking distance of weapons-grade quality. So it wasn't seen as much of an Iranian concession at all by the negotiating team. There is a logical way out of this, of course. The solution is to recognize that any international agreement is one country giving up a sovereign right in order to obtain a corresponding benefit. And so I could imagine a deal in which Iran and the United States agree that Iran has the right to enrich, but chooses not to enrich. Just as the United States has the right to impose economic sanctions, but chooses not to use the right to enforce economic sanctions. And then both sides acknowledge they have sovereign rights, but they agree to give up their rights because they want the benefits of the deal.
Right. But would the Israelis, Thomas Warwick, agree to such a deal? Because it would seem that the Israelis have different red lines than the Americans here.
Well, if there is no Iranian nuclear weapons program, if there is no enrichment above 3.67%, if there is no continuing attacks by Iran on Israel or other Gulf countries, if Iran gives up its support for proxy armies in other countries, then I think Israel will obviously choose to accept that deal. But we are obviously a long way away from that happening.
Okay. Your thoughts, Abbas Aslani. Would Iran make any concessions on any of the points that Thomas mentioned there, including sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz, which seems to be a very critical issue for Iran right now? This is their big bargaining chip, it would seem.
Well, I think expecting Iran not to engage in self-defense in case that it is facing an aggression is kind of strange, thing to be expected from Tehran. But in terms of, I think, the nuclear issue, I don't think that the cases that were mentioned were the subject of the discussion back in Geneva. I think Iran had offered enough compromises to the United States. Look what former National Security Advisor of the U.S. was saying recently about the compromises Iran made. And he was saying that the U.S. team didn't comprehend what those compromises were. And the point is that this doesn't seem to be the nuclear issue. Iran was not enriching before this war, but the U.S. and Israel were thinking of regime change, destroying Iran's military capability. And now they are focusing on the nuclear issue as well. And you cannot expect Iran at the time of, let's say, military attack to compromise on its ballistic missiles. So this is not realistic and acceptable to Tehran.
Eli, your thoughts? I mean, from Tehran's perspective, as Abbas Aslani says there, the ballistic missile program is a defensive necessity. How does Iran reconcile that with global concerns that these weapons extend far beyond self-defense?
Before I do that, let me just pose quite an important correction, which is part of the reason why the Geneva talks failed, was because of a lack of technical understanding regarding what the 20% enrichment of uranium was going to be used as at the Tehran research reactor. Because this has been something that Steve Witkoff has put forward as a reason why that deal was unacceptable. And it has caused a backlash from the expert community to say, actually, the Tehran research reactor that does use less than 20% enriched uranium is not for the purpose of actually stockpiling enrichment, which is why the Omani foreign minister went on US television to explain to the American people, to the White House, that Iran had also agreed to zero stockpiling, which was a major achievement, breakthrough in that last round of negotiation. Now, going on to the missiles issue, this war, if anything, has proven that Iran's only remaining deterrent is its ability to wreak havoc in the region through its missile capabilities. And if the US and Israel plan to essentially neutralize Iran's ability to expand a nuclear program, and that they are taking out one by one Iran's networks of armed militant groups in the region, namely now Hezbollah in Lebanon, Iran will be more determined than ever to hold on to its missile capabilities. And I don't see that as up for negotiation at all in the near term.
All right, Thomas Warwick, your response to what Eli said there about the missile program and also the enrichment issue, which brings us back to what you were saying earlier. And I think, for me, the importance of having technical teams involved in these negotiations.
Well, but this was why failure to hand over the written proposal was so decisive in getting us to a war, because the opportunity to have technical specialists understand the points that you just mentioned was not allowed. And so it was all seen as an effort to achieve some kind of subterfuge and some kind of deceit. This goes to the mistrust issue. I'm afraid that where we're headed is if the discussions we were having here are mirrored in Pakistan, then the war will continue. And it can continue certainly for several more weeks and potentially even beyond that. The one thing that President Trump is getting ready for is opening the Strait of Hormuz by military force. If the United States is able to do that, Iran's biggest bargaining chip is taken off the table. And so at that point, obviously the strategic situation will be different, even if I doubt that that alone would cause Iran to soften some of its other demands.
Which demand, Abbas Aslani, is Iran likely to soften if, as Thomas says, the Americans and Israelis were to reopen the Strait of Hormuz by force?
That remains a question if they can open it militarily. The last option they are thinking of is ground forces and occupation of the number of islands in southern Iran, which will be the beginning of a new, let's say, escalation and rising tensions in the region. And this will open new fronts. And Iran is, insisting that it will continue to fight against the Americans. That will be the time that they can get more fatalities from the American side, as well as, other straits like Bab el-Mandab or Suez Canal also can be added to the story, which can further complicate the situation.
But Abbas, the Americans, can I just interrupt and say and ask you about this important point? Because in the reported 15-point plan, the Americans are no longer talking about regime change in Iran. Does that ease fears in Tehran enough to open the door for talks or not?
No, because, it is not that they are doing a favor to Iran because they couldn't do it. It was initially their plan to bring a regime change. and this is not something which Iran can, consider as an incentive to move toward an agreement. But on the other side, they are talking about ballistic missiles, trying to limit the program, which at the time of war, which is not, acceptable for Iran. And in terms of other issues also, the terms are like, nothing has happened so far, and they are being offered in a vacuum. And new realities need to be taken into account from Iran's perspective, which is mostly now focused on cessation of the hostilities and its terms. Then they can, in future, we don't have any trust remain in this process,
Right.
and through indirect, or let's say de-escalation, if they are able to build up on that, then in the later stages they might be able to discuss those issues.
Okay.
Now time is not right for that kind of discussions, I think.
Ellie, very difficult to predict what's going to happen in the next few days, but whose red lines do you see shifting first, and what would it take for that to happen?
Sadly, I don't see either side at this moment willing to shift red lines. And I do see that there's going to be escalation ahead. If we are in a situation where the US moves ground troops onto Iranian territory, I think that Iran's military has been prepared to ambush US Americans on their lands for some time now. And we are going to see a much more brutal escalation phase of this conflict. And unless international mediators move in before this sort of a ground invasion happens, I don't see scope here. I do think that regional players like Pakistan, Turkey, Egypt can accelerate the mediation directly with Tehran and the US. And right now, the main factor that will make both sides budge is the potential for another forever war in the Middle East.
Okay. All right. Thomas Warwick, what are your thoughts finally? What could make either side budge here?
Ellie is correct. At this point, only a change based on changed military conditions is going to produce any kind of significant shift on either side. And the most likely outcome would be one of two possibilities. First, President Trump could declare a unilateral ceasefire just to see if Iran will go along with that. And it's possible you could have a ceasefire without any political agreement. Then if Iran tries to rebuild its nuclear program or its missile program, the United States will come back in after a few months with another wave of strikes. So we had June of 2025, we have March of 2026. Sometime probably after the U.S. election, there would be another month of airstrikes. That's one possible outcome. The other one is that the war simply continues until something changes. Leadership changes on the Iranian side, further destruction of Iran's missile capabilities, further loss of territory, and then obviously, if Iran wants to drag the Gulf countries into this, they could find themselves fighting not just two countries, but 8 to 10 countries.
All right, we're going to leave it there. Thank you so much to all three of you for a great discussion. Abbas Aslani, Ellie Jeremiah, and Thomas Warwick. And thank you too for watching. You can always watch this program again anytime by visiting our website at aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is at AJ Inside Story. That's it from me, Fully Batibo, and the whole team here. Stand by for Al Jazeera's continuing coverage of the war. More in a moment.